The Duke of Blackwood, Alistair Beaumont, considered the document before him not as a pact between two people, but as a deed of acquisition. It was a masterpiece of legal fortification, drafted by the sharpest minds in London, and its primary purpose was the absorption of the contiguous Vancewood estate into his own sprawling domain. The mechanism for this absorption was marriage. The woman, a Miss Ilara Vance, was merely the living seal upon the wax. "It is, as you requested, ironclad, Your Grace," Mr. Abernathy, his solicitor, murmured. The man was a creature of dry paper and drier wit, his face a testament to decades spent deciphering the convoluted intentions of the aristocracy. Alistair scanned the final clauses, his eyes gliding over the dense script. He cared for the paragraphs concerning water rights, land titles, and mineral extraction. He did not care for the signatory on the other side of the ledger. He had met her once, a brief, gray encounter in a dimly lit drawing room. She was a spinster of 26, unremarkable in every conceivable way. Plain of face, quiet of voice, possessed of an unnerving stillness that he mistook for a lack of spirit. She was the price of Vancewood, a property his family had coveted for a century, now bankrupted by the feckless spending of her cousin, Silas. "Her cousin has signed his assent," Alistair noted, tapping a finger on Silas Vance's florid signature. "And she?" "Miss Vance awaits your final approval of the terms before she adds her name. A formality, of course." Alistair grunted, a sound of dismissive finality. He dipped his own quill in the inkpot, the scratch of the nib the only sound in the cavernous study. "It hardly matters. She has no understanding of law or of anything of consequence. It is merely a signature to her, the transfer of her person from one keeper to another. Ensure it is witnessed. I want the matter concluded by Friday." Mr. Abernathy bowed his head, a slight, almost imperceptible tightening around his lips the only sign of his thoughts. He had seen the woman. He had noted the steady, intelligent gaze that she kept lowered. He suspected the Duke's assessment was, at best, incomplete. But his duty was to the contract, not to the woman it bound. He gathered the papers, the vellum rustling like dry leaves. The Duke of Blackwood was a man who operated on the principles of logic and asset management. His title was a corporation, his lands a portfolio, and his future wife a necessary merger. He felt no malice toward her. He felt nothing at all. She was a line item in a ledger, a solution to a geographical problem. He did not see her. He saw only the map of his lands, the jagged border of Vancewood finally smoothed, finally erased, finally his. He thought himself a master of his world, a man of supreme perception. He was, in fact, profoundly blind. And in her quiet room at Vancewood, Ilara Vance held a pen and understood, with perfect and painful clarity, that she was not beginning a marriage. She was finalizing a sale. The wedding was an exercise in muted efficiency. It occurred in a small, cold chapel, attended by a handful of necessary witnesses. Alistair stood at the altar, a pillar of aristocratic indifference. Ilara, draped in a simple gown the color of winter cream, was a whisper beside him. She made her vows in a low, steady voice that betrayed no emotion whatsoever. He registered the sound, but not the substance. It was a transaction, and the terms were being met. Their arrival at Blackwood Manor was no warmer. The house was a fortress of taste and order, a vast, imposing structure where every surface gleamed and every servant moved with silent, practiced grace. It was his creation, a monument to his control. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, a woman whose severity was legendary among the staff, greeted them at the door. "Your Grace," she said, her address to Alara a clipped, formal afterthought. Alistair gave a curt nod. The Duchess will take the East Wing. See to her needs. It was a dismissal. He turned and walked toward his study, the heart of his empire, leaving his new wife standing in the marble expanse of the entrance hall. He did not look back. He did not see the way Alara's gaze swept over the hall, not with awe, but with a cool, analytical assessment. She was not intimidated by the grandeur. She was cataloging it. Their first weeks together established a pattern of mutual absence. They were two ghosts, haunting the same magnificent shell. They dined together in a cavernous room, separated by a continent of polished mahogany. The silence between them was not awkward. It was structural, as solid and as present as the silver candelabras. He would ask her if the meal was to her satisfaction. She would reply that it was. He would inquire if she had everything she needed. She would confirm that she did. These were not conversations. They were audits. He found her presence, or rather the lack of it, convenient. She made no demands. She did not attempt to alter his routines. She was a specter in gray silk, moving through the house with a quiet purpose he never bothered to investigate. He assumed she occupied herself with the meaningless trifles of her gender: needlepoint, correspondence, staring out of windows. He had provided her with a cage, however gilded, and he assumed she would behave as a canary was meant to. He was mistaken. The first crack in his perception appeared a month into their marriage. His estate steward, a man of meticulous habits, presented the quarterly household accounts. Alistair reviewed them, as he always did, with an unforgiving eye. He noticed a small annotation in a faint, elegant hand next to the supplier ledger for the kitchens. "What is this?" he demanded, his finger jabbing at the note. The steward squinted. I am not certain, Your Grace. The Duchess requested the ledgers last week. She said she wished to understand the running of the household." Alistair felt a flicker of annoyance. It was an intrusion. The note directed him to compare the invoiced price of flour from their primary supplier with the market rates listed in the London circulars. He did so. He discovered they were being overcharged by a significant margin, a practice that had likely been going on for years. It was a clever, subtle fraud, missed by his own meticulous steward and caught by her. He summoned her to the study. She entered as she always did, a study in quiet composure. She did not seem nervous to be in his sanctum. "You reviewed the household accounts," he stated. It was an accusation. "Yes," she replied, her hands clasped loosely before her. "You are the Duke of Blackwood. I am now the Duchess. It seemed prudent to understand the estate I am now a part of." Her logic was unassailable. It was also unexpected. "You found a discrepancy." "I found several," she said, her tone level and matter-of-fact. "The flour was the most obvious. The cost of beeswax candles is inflated by 8%, and the livery supplier has been billing for the shoeing of 10 horses when the stablemaster confirms you only own 9. She presented these facts without triumph, as if reciting from a textbook. He stared at her. For the first time, he was forced to truly look. He saw the clarity in her eyes, the sharp intelligence that lay behind her placid expression. It was like looking at a calm pond and suddenly realizing it was fathoms deep. He was discomfited. He was also impressed, a fact that irritated him even more. "I will have the steward address these issues," he said stiffly. "Thank you." It was a dismissal. She inclined her head and left, leaving him alone with the altered ledgers and the unsettling feeling that a variable he had not accounted for had just been introduced into his perfectly balanced equation. He began to notice other things. The vast, neglected library at Blackwood had been his father's domain, and since his death, it had fallen into a state of dusty disarray. Alistair never used it, preferring the cold functionality of his study. One afternoon, passing by, he heard a faint sound from within. He pushed the heavy oak door open a crack. Ilara was inside, standing on a rolling ladder, her back to him. She was not reading. She was working. Books were arranged in neat stacks on the floor, sorted by subject and size. A ledger lay open on a nearby table, and she was meticulously cataloging the entire collection, her handwriting a model of precision. The air, usually thick with the scent of decay, smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper. She was bringing the room back to life. She was present, and she was absent. She was there, and she was not there. He closed the door without a sound. It felt like an intrusion, as if he had stumbled upon a private ritual. The quiet competence she displayed was a silent reproach to his initial assessment of her. A woman with no understanding of things of consequence was, it seemed, single-handedly rescuing a priceless collection of literature from oblivion. The irony was not lost on him, and it sat like a stone in his gut. Then came the music. He was working late one evening, the papers for a new land enclosure spread across his desk, when he heard it. A faint melody drifting up from the music room on the ground floor. It was a pianoforte. The piece was complex, melancholic, and played with a skill that was far beyond mere parlor proficiency. It was the music of a true artist, full of a deep and resonant feeling that the cold halls of Blackwood had never known. He found himself walking toward the sound, drawn by a force he did not understand. He stood outside the music room door, listening. The music spoke of a world of passion and sorrow he could not reconcile with the gray, silent woman he had married. Who was this person who could find fraud in his accounts, order in his chaos, and such profound beauty in the silence of his house? The music stopped abruptly. He waited, but it did not resume. The silence that rushed back in was heavier, more profound than before. He returned to his study, but the numbers on the page had lost their meaning. He could only hear the ghost of that melody, a question he did not know how to ask. He had acquired Vancewood. He had married Miss Vance. He was beginning to suspect, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had no idea who the Duchess of Blackwood truly was. The catalyst for revelation is often not a grand event, but a small, mundane task. Alistair, searching for a specific deed related to the Vancewood transfer, found his own study in a state of uncharacteristic disarray. Papers he had left in one pile had been moved. Files he had considered organized now seemed haphazard. Irritated, he rang for Mrs. Gable. "The study is a mess," he said, his voice sharp. "Who has been in here?" The housekeeper's expression was unreadable. "The Duchess, Your Grace. You instructed her to occupy herself. She offered to put your files in order. She spent the better part of a week in here." His irritation deepened. Another intrusion. Another instance of her quiet, unnerving competence. He dismissed the housekeeper and began his search. He found the deed he was looking for inside a large vellum portfolio containing all the documents related to the marriage. It was his personal copy of the contract. He pulled it out. As he did, a single sheet of paper, folded neatly, slipped from within its pages and drifted to the floor. He picked it up. It was a letter from his solicitor, Mr. Abernathy, a final confirmation of the terms before the signing. He read the familiar script, a summary of the key clauses, and then he saw the final paragraph, a direct quotation of his own careless words. Mean, and as His Grace himself noted, it is unlikely the bride will scrutinize these particular subclauses, as she has no understanding of law. He stared at the words. They were his. They were arrogant, dismissive, and utterly contemptuous. And they had been left, like a hidden poison, inside the very document that defined her life. He felt a flush of something he could not name. It was not quite shame, not yet. It was the cold shock of being confronted with an ugly truth about himself. He went to place the letter back inside the folio. He stopped. The creases in the paper were wrong. They were too sharp, too precise. It had been folded and unfolded more than once. The original folds were softer, made by Abernathy's clerk. These new folds were deliberate. They were hers. She had been in here for a week, organizing his papers, and she had found this. A sense of dread, cold and heavy, began to settle over him. His mind, suddenly, horribly alert, flew to the contract itself. He forced himself to read it again, not as a landowner, but as she must have read it. He scanned past the obvious clauses about the transfer of the estate. He pushed deeper into the dense legal thicket his lawyers had so skillfully planted. And then he found it. Clause 12, subsection C. It was a thing of brutal elegance. It stipulated that, in the event of any mineral deposits being discovered on the lands formerly known as Vancewood within 50 years of the marriage, all rights and profits thereof would belong exclusively to the title of Blackwood. It was not just a transfer of land. It was a permanent expropriation of all potential future wealth. It was a clause designed to prey on ignorance. It was a clause written for a woman who, he had declared, had no understanding of law. He lowered the document, his hands shaking slightly. He saw it all with a blinding, sickening clarity. He saw her, alone in this study, reading his casual, cruel dismissal of her intelligence. He saw her, her pride wounded, turning to the contract itself. He saw her sharp, analytical mind moving through the dense text, not with confusion, but with the cold precision of a surgeon. He saw the moment she found Clause 12, subsection C, and he understood. He understood why the household accounts were no longer appearing on his desk. He understood why the library restoration had ceased, the books left in silent, half-organized stacks. He understood why the pianoforte was always silent. It was not anger or hysterics that had followed her discovery. It was not a confrontation. It was a quiet closing of a door. She had seen the contempt with which he held her. She had seen the predatory nature of the bargain she had been forced to make, and she had, with a dignity that now seemed monumental, simply withdrawn. She had ceased to contribute her intelligence, her order, her music to a man and a house that had valued her at nothing. She was present, but she was not there. He had made her a ghost. The silence in the house was no longer structural. It was a judgment. The empty chair at the dinner table was no longer a space. It was an accusation. The perfect, cold order of his home, once his pride, now felt like a mausoleum. He had thought her presence was a negligible quantity, a minor addition to his life. He discovered now, with the force of a physical blow, that her absence was a chasm. He thought about the ledgers. He thought about the library. He thought about the music. He thought about the woman he had dismissed as a simpleton. And the scale of his error, the sheer, profound, arrogant foolishness of it, overwhelmed him. He had not just misjudged her. He had insulted the very essence of her. And she, in her quiet, devastating way, had shown him the value of what he had scorned. by simply taking it away. Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, a man who had never been wrong about anything of consequence in his life, sat alone in his study and knew with absolute certainty that he had made the single greatest mistake of his existence. The transaction was complete, but the cost, he was just beginning to understand, was immeasurable. The first step was to find her. It was an act that required more courage than he had anticipated. For days, she had been a phantom, a rustle of silk in a distant hallway, a closed door at the end of the east wing. He had respected her silent retreat, partly out of a nascent, unacknowledged guilt and partly out of cowardice. Now, he had to breach it. He did not find her in her rooms. The suite was immaculate, impersonal. It looked as though it were awaiting an occupant who had not yet arrived. There was no sign of her personality, no book left open, no shawl draped over a chair. It was the room of a guest, not a duchess. He found her in the library. She was standing by a window, looking out at the manicured lawns that were turning gray in the twilight. The room was just as he remembered it from weeks ago, half-ordered, a project suspended in time. The books waited in their neat stacks, silent witnesses to her withdrawal. She did not turn when he entered. He was not sure if she had even heard him. "Ilara," he said. Her name felt foreign on his tongue. He had never used it. She turned slowly. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable. There was no anger in her eyes, no sorrow. There was only a vast, quiet distance. She was looking at him from a great way off. "Your Grace," she replied, her voice as cool and smooth as riverstone. He walked toward her, the contract clutched in his hand. The paper felt toxic, a writ of his own blindness. He stopped a few feet from her, the space between them charged with everything unsaid. "I was in my study," he began, his own voice sounding strained, unfamiliar. "I was looking for a document. I found this." He held up the contract and the solicitor's letter tucked within it. "I saw that it had been read." A flicker of something, acknowledgement perhaps, passed through her eyes. But she said nothing. She simply waited, her stillness a form of power he was only now beginning to recognize. She was not going to help him. She was not going to make this easy. He had to cross the chasm he had created on his own. "I read the letter," he said, forcing the words out. "I read what I said about you." He paused, waiting for a reaction, but there was none. "And then I read the contract again. I read Clause 12. He looked at her, searching for any sign of weakness, any crack in her composure that he could use as a foothold. He found none. She was perfectly, terrifyingly serene. "I was wrong," he said. The words were simple, but they were the hardest he had ever spoken. They were an admission not just of a single error, but of a fundamental flaw in his perception, his character. What I said, what I thought, the assumptions I made, all of it. It was an arrogance beyond measure. I saw a name on a page, a solution to a problem. I did not see a person. I did not see you. He had expected tears or anger, or at the very least, a bitter, "I told you so." He received only her unwavering, analytical gaze. "And what is it you see now, Your Grace?" she asked. Her question was not a plea for compliments. It was a demand for data. The question disarmed him. He had come to confess, to apologize. He had not prepared to be cross-examined. He looked around the half-finished library at the evidence of her intelligence and diligence. He thought of the music that had filled his empty house with feeling. "I see a woman of formidable intellect," he said. the words coming slowly as he pieced them together. I see the person who found the flaws in my accounts that my own steward missed for a decade. I see the scholar who was bringing order to this chaos. I see the artist who played Chopin in a house that has only ever known silence. He took a step closer. I see the woman I insulted from the very beginning, with a contract that was not a marriage agreement, but an act of theft. He walked to the great stone fireplace that dominated one wall. A low fire was burning. Without ceremony, he tossed the contract into the flames. The vellum blackened, curled, and was consumed. The ink that spelled out his arrogance and her bondage turned to ash. "That document is an insult," he said, turning back to her. "It is void. Whatever it represented is over." He felt a sense of catharsis, of a grand gesture well made. He had admitted his fault. He had destroyed the evidence of his crime. He had, he thought, cleared the board. Ilara watched the last corner of the page burn away. Her expression did not change. "Burning a piece of paper is a satisfying piece of theater, Your Grace," she said, her voice still unnervingly calm. "But it changes nothing of substance. The legal transfers are filed with the Crown. Vancewood is yours. The terms, including your odious little clause on mineral rights, are legally binding. You have not voided a contract. You have merely destroyed your copy." His grand gesture dissolved into smoke. He felt like a fool, a boy who had made a dramatic mess he did not know how to clean up. She was, as always, several steps ahead of him. She understood the law. He had only understood the performance. "Then we will draw up a new one," he said, his voice raw with a desperation he did not recognize in himself. "We?" she asked, one eyebrow arching slightly. It was the most emotion she had shown. It was a sliver of her dry, intelligent wit, and it cut him to the quick. "Yes," he insisted. "A new contract. A real one. One that you will draft. You will set the terms. Whatever you want. The mineral rights restored to your family name. An allowance. Authority over this house, this estate. Anything. Everything. I will instruct Abernathy to obey you as he would me." He was pleading. He, the Duke of Blackwood, was standing in his own library, begging for a chance to renegotiate the terms of his own colossal failure. Ilara was silent for a long time. She walked over to one of the stacks of books and ran her fingers along the worn leather spines. "A contract requires consideration from both parties," she said softly, almost to herself. "You have offered assets and legal concessions. That is your side of the bargain. But what is my consideration? What am I to provide in this new arrangement?" Your presence," he stammered, the answer coming to him with sudden, startling clarity. "Your intelligence, your partnership, your music." He looked at her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Just be here, as you were, not as a ghost in my house, but as its duchess." This finally seemed to reach her. The cool, analytical mask softened. A flicker of vulnerability, of the deep hurt he had inflicted, showed in her eyes for the briefest of moments before being shuttered away again. She turned back to him, her gaze direct, her resolve clear. "Very well, Your Grace," she said. "I will consider your proposal. I will draft a new set of terms. I will have them delivered to your study when they are complete. Until then, I require the continued privacy of my own rooms and the silence of this house." It was not forgiveness. It was not acceptance. It was an agreement to open negotiations. It was more than he deserved, and he knew it. "Of course," he said, his voice hoarse. "As you wish." She inclined her head, a gesture of dismissal that was a perfect, chilling echo of his own past behavior. He had been relegated to the position of a petitioner. The power in the cold, silent rooms of Blackwood Manor had irrevocably shifted. He turned and left her there, alone among her books, the smell of burnt paper hanging in the air like a final, damning judgment. The document that arrived on his desk 3 days later was not a list of demands. It was a manifesto. Drafted in Alara's precise hand, it was a reimagining of their entire existence. She did not call it a marriage contract. She titled it Articles of Partnership for the Administration of the Blackwood and Vance Estates. It was a work of genius. It laid out, in clear and unambiguous terms, a division of responsibilities. He would retain oversight of agricultural and political matters. She would assume full authority over the household, the libraries, the social calendar, and the tenant welfare programs, which, the document noted, were in a state of shameful neglect. It established a joint council, consisting of them both, to vote on any expenditure over £1,000. It restored the Vance Wood mineral rights not to her feckless cousin, but to a trust, to be administered by her for the benefit of the land and its people. It stipulated a budget for the restoration of the library and the purchase of a new pianoforte. The final clause was the most telling. It stated that all articles were subject to annual review and renewal, contingent upon mutual respect and satisfactory performance of duties. It was a contract between equals. It offered him a path forward, but it did not offer him absolution. Her trust was not a given. It had to be earned, and its continuance would be reviewed. He read it 3 times, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was the most brilliant, audacious, and utterly romantic document he had ever seen. He summoned Mr. Abernathy at once. The solicitor read the articles, his expression shifting from professional neutrality to profound, undisguised admiration. "Your Grace," Abernathy said, his voice tinged with awe, "the Duchess has a truly remarkable grasp of contract law and of leverage." "Indeed," Alistair replied, a note of pride in his voice that was entirely new. "Have it transcribed legally. Adhere to her wording precisely. Do not change a single comma, and have it ready for my signature by tomorrow." The signing of the second contract was as different from the first as could be imagined. It took place in the library. Alara stood opposite him, her posture erect, her expression serious. Abernathy witnessed. Alistair signed his name with a flourish. Then he slid the document across the table to her. Her signature, unlike the first time, was firm and confident. When it was done, Abernathy discreetly withdrew, leaving them alone. "The terms are agreeable?" she asked, her first direct question to him in weeks. "They are inspired," he said truthfully. He wanted to say more. He wanted to tell her that he had spent the last 3 days in a state of agonizing self-reflection. He wanted to tell her that her absence had taught him more about himself than a lifetime of success and solitude ever had. He wanted to tell her that he was beginning to feel something for her that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. But he understood from the cool reserve in her eyes that words were no longer sufficient. His atonement would not be in apologies, but in actions. The new contract was a blueprint, and now he had to build the structure of their new life, piece by piece. He began the next day. He did not ask her to join him for dinner. Instead, he had a small table set for 2 in the half-restored library, surrounded by her dormant project. He did not sit at the head of the table, but opposite her, as an equal. He did not fill the silence with meaningless questions. He spoke of the estate, of a problem with a tenant farmer, and he asked for her opinion. He listened to her answer. She spoke with the same clarity and insight she brought to everything, offering a solution that was both practical and compassionate. It was the first real conversation they had ever had. He started to bring her things, not jewels or gowns, but items he thought the woman he was discovering might appreciate. A rare book on botany he found in a London shop. A collection of sheet music from a Viennese composer she had mentioned. He would leave them on the table in the library with no expectation of thanks. He would simply see, the next day, that they had been moved. Slowly, tentatively, the life of the house began to return. One afternoon, he heard the faint, hesitant notes of the pianoforte. It was not the passionate Chopin of before, but a simple, questioning melody. He stood in the hall and listened, his heart aching with a fragile hope. He was not just hearing music, he was hearing a door creak open. The true test of his transformation came a month later, with the unannounced arrival of Silas Vance. Her cousin swaggered into Blackwood Manor, all bluster and entitlement, demanding to see the Duke. He had heard rumors of a new contract and was incandescent with rage. Alistair received him in the study, with Alara standing silently by the window. "What is this I hear?" Silas bellowed, foregoing any pleasantries. "You've let her meddle with the agreements? She's a woman. She knows nothing of these things. You'll ruin us both with her sentimental nonsense." Alistair felt a cold, clean rage rise within him. He looked at the blustering fool before him and saw a distorted reflection of his own past self, the same arrogance, the same dismissive contempt. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment before he spoke, his voice low and laced with ice. "You are mistaken on several counts, Mr. Vance," he began. "First, you will moderate your tone in my house and in the presence of my wife. Second, the meddling you refer to was the correction of a predatory and insulting contract that I was foolish enough to approve. And third," he paused, turning his gaze to Alara, a look of profound and public respect in his eyes. "Yeah, the Duchess, as it happens, possesses a more formidable understanding of law, finance, and basic human decency than any man I have ever had the misfortune to know, including, most especially, myself." He turned back to Silas. "Your presence is no longer required. At Blackwood or at Vancewood, the estates are now managed under a partnership, the Duchess's partnership." Silas stared, his mouth agape, utterly defeated by a reality he could not comprehend. He sputtered, turned, and fled the room. When he was gone, Alistair looked at Alara. The distance in her eyes was gone. In its place was a warmth that felt like the sunrise. She had not needed him to defend her. Her own contract was defense enough. But the fact that he had publicly declared her value and his own past folly, was the final clause in their unwritten negotiation. She crossed the room and, for the first time, voluntarily placed her hand on his arm. "Thank you, Alistair," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. It was, he knew, the beginning of everything. A year passed. It was a year of quiet construction. The foundations they had laid with their second contract proved strong. The partnership flourished, transforming not only their relationship, but the estates themselves. The tenant welfare program, under Ilara's meticulous and compassionate administration, became a model for the county. The library was fully restored, a warm, vibrant heart to the once cold manor. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the sound of music, of debate, of laughter. The vast dining room was abandoned in favor of the library, the study, or even the terrace overlooking the gardens. They were rarely apart. Their minds had found a perfect, complementary rhythm. His strategic vision was now tempered and improved by her detailed analysis and human insight. Her plans were given wings by his resources and influence. One evening, they sat together before the library fire, a comfortable silence between them. Ilara was reviewing plans for a new school for the tenant children at Vancewood, a project funded by the initial profits from the trust she managed. Alistair was not looking at the plans. He was looking at her. He watched the firelight play on her face, illuminating the intelligence and quiet strength that he had once been so blind to. He remembered the gray, silent woman he had married, a woman he had dismissed as an object, a mere signatory. He had thought he was acquiring land, securing a border. He had not understood that he was finding the missing half of himself, the part of him that was capable of warmth, of humility, of love. She looked up, catching his gaze. "What is it?" she asked, a soft smile playing on her lips. She knew him so well now. She could read his moods in the set of his jaw, the look in his eyes. "I was just thinking," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, "about our first contract." Her smile did not falter. The memory held no more pain. It was simply a part of their history, the flawed and necessary prologue to their story. "Ah, yes, the one where I had no understanding of law." Her wit was still as sharp as ever, but now it was a shared delight, not a hidden weapon. "I was a fool," he said simply. It was a fact he now stated with ease. "You were," she agreed gently. "But you were a fool who was willing to learn." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. Her other hand rested almost unconsciously on her slightly rounded abdomen, where their first child, the true heir to both Blackwood and Vancewood, now grew. He brought her hand to his lips. "You were the finest teacher I ever had." He had learned that true sight was not about observing the world from a position of power and judging it. It was about paying attention. It was about noticing the details, the annotation in a ledger, the restoration of a forgotten room, the emotion in a silent piece of music. It was about recognizing the immense value in the things and the people that the world, in its arrogance, so often overlooks. He had learned to see, and in doing so, he had learned to love. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, tapping against the library windows. The fire crackled. The great house of Blackwood, once a cold fortress of solitude, was now, finally, a home. And in the warm circle of light, the Duke and his Duchess sat together, partners in every sense of the word, their future stretching before them, a document of their own making, filled with clauses of trust, respect, and a love as strong and as binding as any law ever written. They arrive here whenever they are ready. If you made it to the end of Alistair and Ilara's story, thank you for listening. Their journey was about the power of being truly seen. Tell me in the comments, if you were drafting their articles of partnership, what one condition would you have insisted on adding? I love hearing your ideas. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more tales of love, loss, and the quiet revolutions of the heart. And now, prepare for our next story, where a quiet governess, a grief-stricken widowed earl, and the mystery of a locked nursery reveal that some secrets are not meant to be kept, especially from the heart that is destined to heal them.